Welcome to yet another lecture of the series of British English literature. Today we are going to deal with the Romantic Age. Let's start with this. Now the period which is ranging from between 1780 to 1830 is called the Romantic Age. The major writers, the poets of the age are the Wordsworth, Coleridge. They are considered the founding figures of Romanticism. Now, there were a lot of reforms which were underway during the Romantic Age during this period. There were a lot of social movements like the abolition of slave trade, poor relief, education of the poor, amelioration of prison conditions, and other efforts which were underway to improve the situation of England. Now, there was a rising social discontent among the people of England. There was a fall of Bastille Prison in 1789. And that heralded the very, very big French Revolution moment. Now, such revolutionary works were taking place, and lot of literature which talked about the horrors of the revolution that was written during the age. Edmund Burke wrote Reflections on the Revolution in France, which was published in 1790. Thomas Paine wrote The Rights of Man. Others saw a source of hope for the English, since revolution symbolized early stages of freedom, equality, and liberty. Now, social conditions were deteriorating in various parts of England. The social conditions were deteriorating in various parts of England. There was use of increased mechanization, which made many workers, it rendered many workers jobless, and there was decline in infant mortality. There was increase of Irish immigration, which added to England's population, especially London, because a lot of people which came from Ireland, which came from a very small parts of England, small parts of Europe, they were basically settling in London. So London was becoming a breeding ground for anybody who wanted to proceed, who wanted to prosper, who wanted a job for themselves. Now slums increased. So Peterloo massacre happened, which led to public anger against the government and the monarchy. Romantic Age stressed the role of instinct and emotion, imagination and fancy. These were the terms which were used widely during the Romantic Age. Romantics, they preferred to dwell on the imagination and mind as an escape from the real world, because the real world, it was all about revolution. They were the onset of the French Revolution. So it was basically the writers, they wanted to escape from that harsh reality. So therefore, the importance of fancy and imagination was stressed upon during the Romantic Age. Now, a very famous poet of the times was the Percy Shelley. He called the poets as unacknowledged legislators of mankind. According to Shelley, the task of poet was that of a prophet and a priest. So he put the poets on a very high pedestal. Now let's talk about the features of the romantic non-fiction. Basically, widely essays were written, which were personal essays. Notions of freedom and justice were talked about during the age. Diaries, memoirs, and travelogues were famous during the age. Romantic essay was influenced by the writings and style of the Rousseau and Montesquieu. Features of romantic fiction. The romantic fiction, they were in several forms. And what were those forms? Those were the epistolatory writing, which means the writing which was written in form of the letters. Romance, didactic, Gothic, and historical literature was prevalent. Gothic tradition was given a lot of importance during the age. Local fiction and the regional novel from Ireland and Scotland, they provided glimpses into their culture and history during the age. Now, talking about the Gothic writing, it talked about the darker side of human sensibility, uncontrolled passions, paranoia, evil. Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto is a very good example of Gothic literature. Taboo subjects like incest, blasphemy, black magic, they were widely talked about during the Romantic Age. Wilkie Collins, Bram Stoker, and Charles Dickens, Mary Shelley, these were very famous names which are linked to the Gothic literature. And if you talk about the American writers who wrote in a Gothic traditional manner, it was Edgar Allan Poe. He's a very famous American writer which belongs to this genre. Now, features of romantic poetry. Principal concern was nature, landscape and beauty. Dreams, childhood, innocence were the common themes which were used by the poets of the time. Influence on French Revolution and other political events was A lot of influence was there on the writers who talked about these topics. Now, concerned with inner self, poems mainly exploration of poet's mind. So poems, they talked about the exploration of the poet's mind. Now, if you talk about the Romantic Age poets, the first generation poets were definitely Wordsworth and Coleridge. The second generation of Romantic poets were Keats, Shelley and Byron. There were other very famous poets, and these included some of the poets whom I can name right now. There are a lot. Just as Shelley, Keats' poetry also images the poet as a prophet, just as we talked about a few seconds back. And among the minor poets, which are by no means minor, these are Thomas More, Walter Savage Landor, and Robert Southey. Southey is best known as a victim of Byron's satire. In the latter, Byron wrote The Vision of Judgment, and there he has satirized Robert Southey in his work. Now, Walter Savage Landor, he wrote a fairly popular Oriental work in his Egyptian narrative poem, which is titled as Gebir. Now, George Crabbe, he was the poet of rural England. Like John Clare, he was much affected by the changes in the countryside. Now, talking about the names of some other poets of the Romantic Age who contributed immensely to the age, they are George Crabbe, Walter Savage Landor, John Clare, Thomas Campbell, Thomas Hood. Now, talking about the drama of the Romantic Age, it is definitely not the best genre of the age, but it definitely had a very remarkable impact of the age. Now, during the Revolution, plays had political implications, and which drew crowds to themselves, and they also worried the authorities. Now, there was the prevalence of revolutionary drama. In 1789, St. John, he wrote The Island of St. Margaret. Now, plays from Europe, authors were translated into English during the period. Coleridge and Southey, they wrote a combined work named as The Fall of Robespierre, published in 1794. William Godwin, he wrote Faulkner, published in 1807, and Shelley wrote Charles I, which were both set in 17th century. Now, Shelley, he wrote a very famous work called as the Cenci, which was set in 16th century Rome, and Coleridge Osorio was set in 16th century Spain. Now, Godwin's Faulkner, it was set in Florence of the 17th century. The romantic concern was always with the landscape, beauty and visual description, which has been a subject of extensive study during the age. It should be noted that by 1800, England was on its way to being an empire for India, and India was definitely considered as the wealthiest nation in Asia, and it had been under the political and economic control of the English East India Company. Now, it should be noted that during this age, East India Company, it was trying its level best to conquer India, which was considered as the wealthiest nation. So a lot of literature based on colonization was also written during the age. Also, the vulnerability of European constitutions to strange climate and food, and the dangers of a rich diet constitute central themes in the period, because they were conquering a lot of other countries like India. So they were also vulnerable to the different climates, they were vulnerable to different foods, and that was causing them a lot of disease. So they were becoming disease ridden. So it also the literature of the time was reflective about all these things as well. Just as De Quincey, he wrote Confessions of an English Opium Eater. Now here, a very famous poet of the Romantic Age, who is considered as a first generation poet, Wordsworth. His brother also became prey to the colonial expansion as his ship sank during his return voyage from India. Now, Keats' poetry is also full of images of disease, and his critics even used images. Now, if we talk about the Romantic Age poets, we have bifurcated them according to the generations. The first generation of Romantic poets include Wordsworth and Coleridge. The second generation include Keats, Shelley and Byron. There are other poets, very famous poets, who have contributed a lot to the literature of the Romantic Age. The names of some of them are Robert Southey, George Crabbe, John Clare, Thomas More, and many more. Now, if we talk about Wordsworth, lifespan from 1770 to 1850. His main theme has always been man and nature. It should be noted that Wordsworth, with Coleridge, they wrote a very famous work which heralded the beginning of English Romantic movement, and that work was called Lyrical Ballads, which was published in 1798. It was basically a collection of poems written by both the poets. He has written Prelude, which was published in 1805. It is autobiographical poem, subtitled as Growth of a Poet's Mind. Now, he had a very strong friendship with Coleridge, and that resulted in the publication of their lyrical ballads. Wordsworth declared that the rural themes will be included in the lyrical ballads, and that had to be his central theme in the poem. Poets, according to Wordsworth, he said that poets should always use the language of everyday. Their language should be easy and it should be relatable to the person who's reading it. He always talked about the relation of a person with nature and how nature healed persons in a battle. Now, he is always also called as a self-absorbed poet. Talking about Coleridge, his poems journey into the self and simultaneously into the external world. Now, some names of his very well-known poems are Christabel, Kubla Khan, Ancient Mariner. These poems are dramatic and reflective at the same time. Now, Shelley, he started as a rebel. He was dismissed from Oxford for publishing The Necessity of Atheism. Now, here I would like to give you a disclaimer that I am not talking about all the works of the poet, because these poets are very well distinguished poets and they have written a vast number of poems and work to their credit. In this video, I would not be able to share everything that they have written, but I am focusing only on the most important ones. Although the ones which I am leaving, which I am unable to share it in this video, are also very well accredited works of these poets. So we are in this video, we are talking about all these poets in brief. I am just trying to cover up the most important works of these poets and trying to give you just a background, just an idea of what the Romantic Age looked like and what were the names of its most important writers. Now, if you talk about Shelley, he was dismissed from his university, Oxford, as he published The Necessity of Atheism. Now, Shelley, he rejected religious and moral sanctions of the society of his time. Now, coming to John Keats. John Keats was the last of the great Romantic poets. His poetry images poets as prophets, just as Shelley called poets as prophets. He wrote very famous works which are like Hymn to Intellectual Beauty, Mont Blanc, Ode to the West Wind, To the Skylark. Now, he wrote two narrative poems which are the Hyperion and Endymion. Now, Endymion, if you talk about the writing style and the content of the poem, this narrative poem, it maps the 4 stages of experiment of nature, of art, of friendship, and of love. Now, Hyperion, it took stories from Renaissance and the Greek and Roman history in his narrative. Now, Keats' life was disease-ridden, and therefore it resulted in his writing fine meditation on death and life. Now, these meditations on death and art and life, it is visible in his works, just as Ode to a Nightingale, Ode on a Grecian Urn. Now, human mortality and the permanence of art are twin poles of Keats' work. So basically, he talked about the mortality, he talked about the permanence of art, and they played a major role in his writing style. Used images of pestilence to disparage him. Now, over in all Romantic literature, culture was shaped by the medical and pathological consequences of colonial expansion. Now, I hope you would have got some idea of what Romantic literature looked like. We could not talk about everything in detail because it was the series. It's all about talking in brief about the period, just to give you an idea of how the period looked like. So I hope you would have liked the lecture. See you in the next one. Thank you.